It was a cold December morning in 2021 when a construction worker spotted something strange in a muddy Alabama creek. A flash of rusty metal beneath the shallow water. He thought it was junk, maybe an old car someone had dumped decades ago. The kind of thing you see in remote areas where people dispose of things they don't want anyone to find. But as he got closer, something felt off. The positioning of the vehicle. The way it sat perfectly concealed beneath years of sediment and overgrowth. It was as if the earth itself had been keeping a secret. When investigators pulled it out, their faces went pale. Inside the twisted wreckage was a skeletal body and a 1974 Ford Pinto that had been missing since 1976. The white paint had been stripped away by time, the interior consumed by decay, but the vehicle identification number told a story that made veteran officers' hands shake as they read it. The name that echoed through the small Georgia town that night, Kyle Clinkscales, a 22-year-old college student who had simply vanished one rainy night and whose disappearance had haunted his parents, tormented investigators, and mystified an entire community for the rest of their lives. This is the story of how a routine construction project solved one of the South's most enduring mysteries, and finally brought a mother's decades-long vigil to an end, just 3 months too late. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, we need to go back to January 1976. Kyle Clinkscales was everything a parent could hope for. Smart, responsible, hardworking. He was a senior at Auburn University, studying business administration, with dreams of one day running his own company. He was the kind of young man who called his parents every Sunday, who never forgot a birthday, who still treated his childhood home in LaGrange, Georgia, like it was the center of his universe. On the evening of January 27, 1976, Kyle left his part-time job at the Moose Club in LaGrange. He'd worked a typical shift, nothing unusual. Co-workers would later tell police he seemed in good spirits, talking about an exam he had coming up and making plans for the weekend. He climbed into his white 1974 Ford Pinto, a modest car, but one he'd saved for and was proud to own, and began the drive back to Auburn University. It was supposed to be an easy 45-minute drive along Highway 29, a route he'd taken dozens of times before. Kyle knew every turn, every landmark, every gas station along the way. The weather wasn't ideal. There had been rain earlier that evening, and the roads were slick, but nothing that would have worried an experienced driver like Kyle. But Kyle never made it home that night. He didn't arrive at his dormitory. He didn't call his parents. By the next morning, when he failed to show up for his classes, friends knew something was terribly wrong. His parents, John and Louise Clinkscales, reported him missing immediately. The response was swift. Police searched highways, rivers, back roads, nothing. They interviewed his friends, his co-workers, his professors. Everyone said the same thing. Kyle wasn't the type to just disappear. He wasn't running from anything. He had no reason to vanish. Search parties combed the woods along Highway 29. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning for any sign of the white Pinto. Divers plunged into nearby bodies of water. Tips came in from across the state, each one leading nowhere. No car, no body, no clues. Just an impossible, suffocating silence. In those early days, John and Louise clung to hope. Maybe Kyle had an accident and was suffering from amnesia. Maybe he'd been picked up by someone and was too injured to contact them. Maybe, somehow, he was still alive out there somewhere, trying to find his way home. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, that hope began to crack under the weight of reality. For years, Louise Clinkscales refused to give up. While John tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Louise became consumed by the search for her son. She called every sheriff's department within 100 miles. She contacted state police, the FBI, anyone who would listen. She reached out to psychics who claimed they could see beyond the living, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could tell her where her boy was. She even kept Kyle's bedroom exactly as he left it. The posters on the wall, the textbooks stacked on his desk, the guitar in the corner he'd been teaching himself to play. His auburn pennant still hung above his bed. His clothes remained in the closet. Every morning, Louise would stand in that doorway and look at the room, as if by sheer force of will she could bring him back. Friends and family worried about her. They gently suggested that maybe it was time to accept that Kyle might not be coming home, that holding onto his room like a shrine wasn't healthy. But Louise would hear none of it. "A mother knows," she would say, "and I know my son didn't just leave. Something happened to him, and I won't rest until I find out what." The case haunted the local police department too. Investigators who had worked Kyle's disappearance in 1976 would retire, but they'd pass the file to the next generation, making them promise to never let it go cold. Kyle's face appeared on missing persons bulletins for decades. Every few years, there would be a new lead, a sighting, a rumor, an anonymous tip, and the investigation would flare back to life, only to fizzle out again when the lead proved false. As the years passed, the theories multiplied. Some said Kyle had run away, unable to handle the pressure of school and family expectations. But those who knew him dismissed this immediately. Kyle loved his family, was excited about his future, and had no history of depression or anxiety. Others whispered about foul play. In the mid-1970s, there had been reports of suspicious activity along Highway 29, stories of cars being run off the road, of travelers being robbed. Some speculated that Kyle had seen something he shouldn't have, or that he trusted the wrong person that night. Maybe someone had flagged him down, pretending to need help, and then, well, no one wanted to finish that thought. The most painful theory for the Clinkscales family was the possibility that Kyle's disappearance was connected to criminal activity in the area. There were rumors, never substantiated but persistent, that Kyle might have witnessed something related to organized crime or drug trafficking, and had been silenced as a result. In the 1980s and 1990s, the case would occasionally make local news, usually on anniversaries of Kyle's disappearance. Reporters would interview John and Louise, now graying and weathered by decades of grief. Louise would sit in Kyle's preserved bedroom and talk about her son as if he'd just left yesterday, her eyes distant but determined. Then came a breakthrough, or what seemed like one. In 2005, nearly 3 decades after Kyle's disappearance, police arrested 2 men in an unrelated case. During questioning, one of them claimed to know what happened to Kyle Clinkscales. According to this informant, Kyle had been killed that night in January 1976. His body had been disposed of, his car crushed and hidden in a junkyard or possibly dumped in a remote location. The revelation sent shockwaves through Lagrange. Finally, after all these years, answers. Louise allowed herself to believe that this was it, the closure she'd been searching for since 1976. But the story fell apart almost as quickly as it emerged. The informant's account was riddled with inconsistencies. He couldn't provide specific locations. Physical evidence was non-existent. Authorities suspected the man was fabricating the story, either for attention or to leverage a plea deal in his own case. Once again, the trail went cold. Once again, the Clinkscales family was left with nothing but questions and that terrible, gnawing uncertainty that never goes away. Louise's health began to decline in her later years. The decades of stress, of sleepless nights wondering what happened to her son, had taken their toll. But even as her body weakened, her determination never wavered. She made her surviving family members promise that they would continue the search after she was gone. On June 30th, 2021, Louise Clinkscales died at the age of 90. She was buried in Lagrange, having never received the answers she'd spent 45 years searching for. The woman who had refused to give up on her son, who had kept his room as a monument to hope, went to her grave without knowing his fate. It seemed like one of those tragedies where the truth dies with those who searched for it. But fate, as it turns out, had one more twist in store. 3 months after Louise's death, on December 7, 2021, a construction crew was working on a project near County Road 83 in Chambers County, Alabama. The area was rural, heavily wooded, with small creeks winding through the landscape, the kind of place where nature slowly reclaims whatever humans abandon. One of the workers, whose name was never publicly released, was walking along a creek bed when something caught his eye. There, partially submerged in the murky water and tangled in decades of vegetation, was what appeared to be a vehicle. The water was shallow, only a few feet deep, but the car had been there so long that sediment and plant growth had nearly swallowed it whole. At first, he assumed it was just another piece of junk. Rural Alabama has plenty of places where old vehicles end up abandoned, slowly rusting away into nothing. But something about this one nagged at him. The way it was positioned, angled down into the creek as if it had driven straight in. The complete absence of any graffiti or obvious signs of vandalism that you'd expect on an abandoned car. He called his supervisor, who called local authorities. When Chambers County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they immediately understood that this was no ordinary abandoned vehicle. The location was eerily close to Highway 29, the same highway Kyle Clinkscales had been traveling the night he disappeared. The recovery operation took hours. A tow truck was brought in, along with specialized equipment to safely extract the vehicle from the creek bed without disturbing potential evidence. As the car emerged from the water, covered in mud and rust, investigators held their breath. It was a white 1974 Ford Pinto. The paint had been stripped away by 45 years of submersion, but the body style was unmistakable. And there, still barely visible on the deteriorated bumper, was an Auburn University parking tag. Sheriff Sid Lockhart, who had worked in law enforcement for decades, later said that moment was one of the most surreal of his career. We'd all heard about Kyle Clinkscales. It was one of those cases that every officer in the region knew about. And here we were, looking at his car, after 45 years. But the discovery wasn't over. As investigators carefully examined the interior of the vehicle, they found skeletal remains in the driver's seat, still positioned behind the steering wheel. Decades underwater had reduced soft tissue to nothing, but bones remained, along with items that had resisted decay. A wallet, student ID cards, personal effects that told the story of a young man frozen in time. The forensic investigation that followed was painstaking. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences took custody of the remains, along with everything recovered from the vehicle. Dental records were compared. The vehicle identification number was confirmed. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and analyzed. Meanwhile, investigators began reconstructing what might have happened that night in January 1976. The location where the car was found was only about 19 miles from LaGrange, nowhere near Auburn University, where Kyle had been headed. More significantly, the car was found about 200 feet from Highway 29, down an embankment and into a creek that wasn't easily visible from the road. Accident reconstruction specialists examined the scene. The prevailing theory that emerged was both simple and heartbreaking. On that rainy January night, Kyle had likely missed a curve or drifted off the road, perhaps due to the wet conditions or a moment of inattention. The car had plunged down the embankment, crashed through trees and brush, and come to rest in the creek. The water level would have been higher in 1976 due to winter rains, possibly high enough to enter the vehicle. If Kyle had been injured in the crash, and the angle of descent suggested it would have been violent, he may not have been able to escape before the car filled with water or before succumbing to injuries. But here's what haunted investigators. This stretch of road had been searched in 1976. Search parties had walked along Highway 29. How had they missed a car just 200 feet from the road? The answer lay in the terrain and the passage of time. The embankment was steep and heavily wooded. In 1976, even more vegetation would have obscured the view from the road. The white Pinto, once it crashed through the trees, would have been invisible from above. And over 45 years, nature had done its work, covering the vehicle with sediment, plant growth, and debris until it became part of the landscape. Multiple search parties had likely walked within yards of Kyle's car and never knew it. On January 27, 2022, exactly 46 years after Kyle disappeared, the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences released their official findings. The skeletal remains recovered from the 1974 Ford Pinto were positively identified as Kyle Wade Clinkscales. After 45 years, Kyle had been found. The news spread through LaGrange like wildfire. For those who had known the Clinkscales family, who had watched Louise spend her life searching, the emotions were complex. Relief that the mystery was solved, but profound sadness that Louise had died just 3 months before the discovery. Kyle's surviving family members released a statement thanking law enforcement and the construction worker who made the discovery. They expressed grief that Louise never got her answers, but also a sense of peace that Kyle could finally be laid to rest with the dignity he deserved. The discovery of Kyle Clinkscales sparked renewed attention to other long-term missing persons cases across the country. How many other families were living the same nightmare the Clinkscales family had endured? How many other vehicles were out there, hidden by time and terrain, waiting to be found? In the months following Kyle's discovery, multiple law enforcement agencies began using new technology to search areas that had been previously combed decades earlier. Ground-penetrating radar, improved sonar equipment, and drone technology with thermal imaging capabilities were all being deployed to find what human eyes might have missed. The case also highlighted the importance of never giving up on cold cases. The original investigators from 1976 were long retired or deceased, but they had kept meticulous records. Their files, preserved for over 4 decades, contained details that helped modern investigators quickly identify the vehicle and understand the case history. For the law enforcement officers who had worked Kyle's case over the years, the discovery brought mixed emotions. Relief that the mystery was solved, certainly, but also regret that Louise never got her answers, regret that the car had been there all along, so close to where searches had been conducted. Sheriff Lockhart, in a press conference after the identification was confirmed, spoke about the emotional toll these cases take on everyone involved. You think about Kyle's parents, how they spent their entire lives not knowing. You think about Kyle himself, a young man with his whole future ahead of him, and you think about all the what-ifs. What if we'd searched that area more thoroughly? What if someone had noticed something? Those questions will haunt us. The case also prompted discussions about road safety and the importance of guardrails and improved signage, particularly on rural highways where a single mistake can prove fatal. But perhaps most importantly, Kyle's story became a reminder of something fundamental about missing persons cases. Closure matters. For 45 years, the Clinkscales family lived in a state of perpetual limbo, unable to grieve properly because they didn't know if they should mourn or hope. That uncertainty is a unique kind of torture, one that Louise Clinkscales endured until her dying day. Kyle was finally laid to rest in 2022. In a ceremony attended by family members, friends, and law enforcement officers who had worked on his case over the decades. His grave is next to his mother's, finally reunited after 45 years apart. In LaGrange, Kyle's bedroom, preserved by his mother for so many years, was finally packed up, but the family kept a few items: his auburn pennant, some photographs, his student ID that had been recovered from the car. Small pieces of a life cut short, but memories that would endure. There's something deeply haunting about the idea that Kyle had been there all along, waiting to be discovered, just a few miles off the highway everyone drove every day. For 45 years, tens of thousands of cars passed within yards of where he lay, and no one knew. His parents never got the answers they begged for, but maybe, somewhere, there's peace in knowing the search is finally over. Louise Clinkscales kept her son's room ready for him for 45 years, never giving up hope. In the end, she was right to never stop believing that someday, somehow, Kyle would come home. A car in the mud, a boy frozen in time, a 45-year silence finally broken. Sometimes, the truth isn't lost, it's just waiting to be found. And sometimes, when it's finally discovered, it reminds us that every missing person is someone's child, someone's friend, someone who is loved and missed and desperately searched for. Kyle Clinkscales was finally found. May he rest in peace, reunited with the mother who never stopped looking for him.